Okay, so I'm gonna just talk about the first battle of Fallujah today. I'll do the second battle, most likely, might not, depends on what I want to do. But Operation Vagrant Resolve is especially interesting because it wasn't simply a straightforward U.S. assault. It became a political, military, and crisis that ultimately set the stage for the much larger Second Battle of Fallujah in November. The situation before the battle, Fallujah was a predominantly Sunni Muslim city about 40 miles from Baghdad, about west. After the 2003 invasion, the overthrow of Hussein, the city became increasingly hostile towards the U.S.-led coalition forces. 2004, Fallujah had become a major center for ISIS insurgency. U.S. Marines from the 1st Marine Division had responsibility for the area. There were frequent attacks involving small arms fire, mortars, rocket projectile grenades, IEDs, ambushes, attacks on coalition patrols. The Marines were trying to balance two objectives: suppress the insurgency while avoiding turning the entire population against them. The event that triggered the battle was on March 31st. Four American contractors working for Blackwater entered Fallujah. Their vehicles were attacked by insurgents. Four men were killed, and their bodies were mutilated and publicly displayed. The incident obviously caused enormous outrage in the United States. The United States military officially decided that Fallujah's insurgent networks needed to be destroyed. Then this is where Operation Vagrant Resolve begins. On April 4th, 2004, U.S. Marines began moving into Fallujah. The force included Marines from such units as the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, other elements of the 1st Marines Division, and supporting Army and coalition forces. The Marines intended to conduct a relatively limited operation, pretty much find the insurgents responsible for the attacks, arrest or kill them, and restore control to Fallujah. Things quickly became, well, let's just say, a little bit harder. The Marines entered the city. Fallujah was a difficult battlefield. The city had narrow streets, dense neighborhoods, large numbers of buildings, markets, industrial areas, numerous places for insurgents to hide. That's pretty bad to have. The insurgents had prepared defensive positions and knew the city extremely well. Instead of just leaving the city when the U.S. and coalition forces invaded the city, many fighters just chose to stay and fought the U.S. Marine Corps and Marines immediately, pretty much, got ambushes. The Marine Corps and different patrols from the Army and coalition forces may be moving through the city, then ultimately come in under fire immediately. The Marines would, once after a little bit, have to determine where the fire was coming from, while trying not to get unnecessarily damage the civilian buildings around. April 4th day, fighting really does intensify. The first several days became extremely violent. Marines fought through several neighborhoods while insurgents used ambushes, then disappear. They relocate their location, then attacked it again, and so on, over and over and over. The insurgents made it difficult to pin them down. They weren't genuinely standing in one huge defense line. Instead, fighters operated from houses, alleys, rooftops, mosques, and other structures. The Marines respond with infantry, machine guns, mortars, armored vehicle, and air support. But there was a major problem, of course. Fallujah still had civilians inside the city. This made the operation enormously complicated. The U.S. military would have used overwhelming firepower against entire neighborhoods, but doing so risked killing civilians, and the U.S. doesn't want to kill civilians and destroying the city. The Marines therefore had to fight a much more constrained battle. The Marines' biggest problem, politics. This is where Fallujah becomes particularly important. The military situation was only half the problem. The political situation was changing consistently. Images and reports of the fighting and civilian casualties were spreading enormously. Iraqi political leaders were increasingly concerned about what was happening. So Iraqi officials warned that the offense was making the situation worse. At the time, the insurgents were using the fighting to rally additional support. So the U.S. military had a different choice. They could continue and potentially destroy the insurgent stronghold, but this could risk enormous casualties and political consequences. So pretty much killing a bunch of civilians and possible war crimes. So if they would stop attacking, reduce immediate casualties and political pressure, but allow the insurgency to survive in Fallujah. Ultimately, the second option won, surprisingly. The Mosque controversy. Mosques became particularly sensitive locations. Insurgents sometimes used religious buildings or their surrounding areas during the fighting. U.S. forces were extremely cautious about attacking these places because destroying a building like this could generate enormous anger throughout Iraq, and U.S. doesn't want any more hate from the people in Iraq, so that would be a bad thing also. This obviously contributed to the difficulty of clearing the city. The Marines take casualties. The fighting was not easy for the Marines. No fighting's easy. None is so. During the April battle, Marines were killed and hundreds were wounded. Some units experienced particularly intense fighting while attempting to clear neighborhoods. This wasn't the kind of battlefield where a Marine could easily tell where the enemy was. An enemy fighter could potentially be in a house, behind a wall or something, on a rooftop of a building, or in an alley between the buildings, or inside of a vehicle that may be rigged with bombs. Moving between buildings and moving after firing, they could disappear into the city. Why didn't the U.S. simply just take Fallujah during the battle? This may be the biggest question around the Battle of Fallujah in 2004 between April and May. The Marines could have continued pushing into Fallujah, but Washington and coalition leadership became increasingly concerned about civilian casualties because we don't want civilians to die and damage to the city. Iraqi political observation, national reaction to the possibility of creating even more insurgents. 2. The upcoming transition to Iraqi sovereignty. Eventually, the decision was made to stop the major offensive. The Fallujah Brigade, instead of completely occupying the city, the coalition attempted a different solution. A force called the Fallujah Brigade was established. It was largely former Iraqi military personnel and local fighters. The idea was essentially let Iraqi forces take responsibility for Fallujah instead of keeping large number of U.S. Marines inside the city. so essentially making it where Iraq people can keep the city to themselves and not have U.S. Marine Corps intervention inside of it. But the problem was the Fallujah Brigade was extremely unreliable. Great. They were unreliable for the U.S. Some of its members had sympathies with the insurgency. Weapons and equipment supplied to the brigade could end up benefiting the insurgents. Honestly, doing the research for this video is kind of making me crash out. Benefiting the insurgents. The coalition, therefore, hadn't really solved the underlying problem. The result, by late April, major U.S. offensive operations had stopped. The Marines pulled back from much of the city, and this created a strange situation. The situation was the United States of America had fought its way into Fallujah, but they hadn't actually defeated the insurgency. Fallujah effectively remained outside full coalition control. Insurgent groups became stronger. Foreign fighters entered the city, and one of the most important insurgent leaders in Iraq, most likely going to butcher this name, Abu Musab, and Abu Musab. Okay, I'm not saying this name. I don't speak Iraqi, but if you know what I'm talking about, you know who it is. Eventually established a major presence in the area. Why this led directly to the Second Battle of Fallujah? This is really the important part about this. The first battle didn't solve the Fallujah problem. Instead, Fallujah became an increasingly powerful insurgent stronghold. Over the following months, April 2004, after the United States attacked Fallujah. So pretty much, the United States withdraws from major offensive operations. Then the insurgents pretty much take the most of the city back. So pretty much like the Taliban did in 2021. Fallujah becomes a major insurgent sanctuary. Coalition eventually decides it has to retake the city. November 2004, the Second Battle of Fallujah. The second battle was far larger and more destructive. The biggest lesson from Fallujah, the First Battle of Fallujah, demonstrated one of the hardest problems in modern urban warfare. Winning a firefight isn't necessary, the same thing as winning the battle. The Marines were capable of fighting their way through Fallujah, but military victory had to be balanced against political objectives and civilian protection, because they are top priority. Iraqi sovereignty and broader insurgency. So that's why Fallujah is so fascinating from a military history nerd's perspective, like me. Like, the battlefield digressions couldn't be separated from the political balances being made in Baghdad and Washington. So that's really the whole recap and story of the First Battle of Fallujah. So that's how this video is, and it's the longest video I've ever made. But I will say thank you for watching this video, and watch out for part 2 of this series for the Second Battle of Fallujah.